Well, what is the latest with what is going on in Ukraine ever since Prigozhin staged his insurrection or rebellion or coup or whatever we're calling it? He's been exiled to Belarus, but there have been some now updates to this story that maybe some of his end game was to capture some of the top military brass. There's reports that some other military brass, top Russian military brass, are missing. There's also reports that Prigozhin is no longer going to be, Wagner Group in general is no longer going to be fighting in Ukraine. So what is the latest with everything that is going on, the fallout from this rebellion of Prigozhin's? With us now is Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and vet. Scott, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
What do you make of, first of all, just the rebellion itself, this uprising? There's been a lot of, well, it's just hard to kind of wrap our minds around what would lead Prigozhin to get to this point. What is your assessment of what got him there? Do you think that there was like NATO forces involved? Was he just angry? Is he crazy? Like, what do you think happened there?
Well, we have to keep in mind that Prigozhin is not a military man. He's a businessman. And Wagner Group is a business. In May of 2022, Wagner received a $940 million contract from the Ministry of Defense of Russia to create a combat unit on the territory of the Lugansk People's Republic. Wagner was allowed to do this because Lugansk People's Republic wasn't Russian soil. It was an independent republic at that point in time. Russian law does not permit private military contractors. Russian law doesn't permit private armies forming on Russian soil. But Wagner was deemed to be the quickest way to get military resources to that area, so the Russians contracted him. Wagner, the military force that was formed, was formed of very capable professionals, veterans who performed very well on the field of battle, developing a much-deserved reputation for being, elite is an overused word, but for being tenacious, for being violent, and for winning. The problem for Prigozhin came in September of 2022 when Lugansk held a referendum to join the Russian Federation and was absorbed. At that point in time, legally speaking, Wagner was in breach of the law. But the Ministry of Defense said, because we signed a contract with you, we'll continue to allow Wagner to operate until the end of that contract, at which time Wagner will have to convert to a volunteer unit working for the Ministry of Defense. Your business deal is over. This was not acceptable to Prigozhin. He was making a lot of money. And so basically what I'm trying to tell you is that his fundamental motivating factor was greed, pure greed. And so Prigozhin started a public relations campaign lashing out at the people he deemed responsible for this, Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, and Gerasimov, the Chief of the General Staff. And he began denigrating them, belittling their competence, calling them, basically called them traitors to Russia, saying that their approach to war was inefficient, was costing Russia thousands of lives, that he alone, Prigozhin, a man with no military experience, by the way, Prigozhin and Wagner could save the day. And the key thing was that Russia had to keep Wagner in place. Neither Shoigu nor Gerasimov nor Putin bought into this. Prigozhin made multiple appeals to Putin. And then at the end of the day, the Russians said, no, you're out of luck. And this is what prompted Prigozhin to launch. He had done this PR campaign and at the point where Wagner was a mythical unit in Russian, in the mindset of the Russian people. When you spoke about Wagner, they were like, Wagner, these are the winners. These are the real Russians. These are the real soldiers. These are the patriots. And I'm not denying any of that for the Wagner soldiers, but that's sort of denigrating the other Russian fighters. One of the things Prigozhin has famously said is that Wagner knows how to fight. We reduce casualties for the Russians. But the facts speak otherwise. To give you an example, the battle for Bakhmut, which was a Wagner victory, 75,000 Ukrainians were killed. That's a big number. 30,000 Wagner soldiers were killed. That's a big number. That's like a 2.2 to 1 kill ratio in favor of the Russians. Now, Gerasimov and Shoigu, whom Prigozhin is denigrating, have just built a Russian defense to counter the Ukrainian counterattack. 13,000 Ukrainians have been killed to date. 1,300 Russians have been killed. That's a 10-to-1 kill ratio, 10-to-1 in favor of Russia. Who's the better military force? The 10-to-1 or the 2.1-to-1? That's my point. There's a lot of hype around here. So Prigozhin basically realized that if things stood as they were, he was not going to be able to hold on to this business. He believed that, and he was led to believe, that if he made a march on Moscow, that he would be supported by the military, that he'd be supported by the people, he would be supported by politicians, by businessmen, and that he could bring down the Ministry of Defense. You say the two people he wanted to arrest were Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, and Gerasimov, the chief of staff. But as he moved in, nobody rallied to his cause, not a single person. And at the end of the day, when the forward elements of Wagner approached Serpukhov, a suburb south of Moscow, they ran into 2,500 Russian special forces who said, 1 inch more and we kill you all. So it was a free ride up until then, relatively free. Wagner shot down some helicopters, killed 12 pilots. The Russians fired a missile at Wagner to prove that they could kill them, and they had killed 2 soldiers. 10,000 Chechen Akhmat special forces surrounded Rostov. A lot of people don't talk about this. They sent a signal to Prigozhin. As soon as Putin says, go, we're coming in, we're going to kill you. We're going to kill all the Wagner people. See, Wagner's not immortal. They're not invincible. They were operating outside their base of operations, and they had no sustainability. Prigozhin backed down because the only alternative was to die. Putin did not want to have a civil war, so he accepted the retreat of Prigozhin and gave him amnesty, so to speak, to go to Belarus. But here's the kicker. Remember Al Capone, that gangster back in the day? Murderer, beat people up, theft. What did he go to jail for? Tax evasion. See, Prigozhin got amnesty for committing treason, because that's what he did. He committed treason. But he's being investigated now for corruption, for embezzlement. And he's going to go down because everybody knows he was the biggest crook around.
Why didn't Russia just use their troops from the beginning? I mean, why did they really need to use this Wagner group to go in to fight this special military operation?
When the special military operation was conceived, it was meant to be a very short operation. The goal was to hit Ukraine with sort of a shock and awe, not to capture Kiev, not to overthrow the government, but to compel the Ukrainian government back to the negotiating table. You know, we just recently found out that the Russians and Ukrainians were negotiating up until the day that Putin ordered troops across the border. That the Russians were telling the Ukrainians, hey, look, we can resolve this peacefully. We just need you to sign a treaty similar to the Minsk Accords that you walked away from, and all of this will go away. You'll get to keep everything except the Donbass and Crimea, but that's it. War's over. Ukraine said no, the war started, and Russia's objective was to get them back to the negotiating table, and they succeeded. 3 negotiations in Gomel in early March. 1 April, they were supposed to meet in Istanbul to sign a treaty. In fact, as in the lead up to that, in meetings in Turkey, the Ukrainians actually signed the draft treaty, said, yes, we agree to this, formalize it, we'll sign it. They walked away from that at the behest of the British, and then the British and Americans began pouring in tens of billions of dollars worth of equipment. So what I'm trying to point out is the original force structure of the Russians, around 180, 200,000 troops, were not designed to wage this massive war. They were designed to shock the Ukrainians. When that failed, they had to go back to, okay, what's next? The military occupation of the Donbass. But here's where the Russians looked at their forces and said, we don't have sufficient forces to the task. Wagner will be created to help the militias of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic solidify their strength and begin offensive operations, because there wasn't enough Russian troops, and Putin at that point in time wasn't willing to go into a mobilization. So Wagner was designed to fill a need at the time that existed.
It's kind of ironic when you're explaining all of this, because you're saying that really the Russians amassed at the Ukrainian border as a tactic, a negotiation tactic, trying to get Ukraine to the table. And when that ultimately failed, they went into the country. And it's kind of like, that's what Prigozhin just did. I mean, he basically said, okay, I'm negotiating. I don't want Wagner Group to dissipate. We're in it, and so and when the negotiations seemed to fail, he then said, "Well, then we're marching in, and we're going to try to, the
Right.
shock and awe." And ultimately, it was very shocking, and there was a lot of awe. And then again, the negotiations didn't work out. It's almost like the exact same tactic, just used
Right.
again,
Except that
and it didn't work.
Prigozhin has no legal standing. Prigozhin's a nobody. Prigozhin has no authority. Prigozhin is a traitor. There's not a professional military officer in the world that can support what Prigozhin did because it betrays everything a professional military officer is supposed to stand for.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely right. I mean, there's no doubt that that's not supposed to be happening within a military for sure. If you go trying to march on your country, yeah, there's usually some pretty big consequences to that. We've seen what happened even with January 6th and how harshly those people were treated versus even how Putin has been with this particular armed rebellion, which is much different. A military force coming after your capital city is quite very, obviously, yes, it's treason. Um, Now there's been reports that Prigozhin is getting some amnesty in Belarus, but you're saying, yeah, but he's going to go down for other things. They're going to make sure he pays one way or the other. There were reports that have come out from Moscow Times saying that Surovikin, so General Surovikin had been arrested, that he was part of this. So he's one of the top brass in the Russian military. And they were reporting that, and this actually came out even prior to the Moscow Times. There was reports in the U.S. Mainstream media saying that top brass in the Russian military were involved, or that they had sanctioned this, that they had said, okay, yeah, Prigozhin, we're with you. And no one really believed that. It kind of looked like, when the New York Times is saying this, it's like, well, of course they have reason to try to, instill doubt inside of the Russian military after something like this happens. But then we get reports from the Moscow Times a day later that General Surovikin had been arrested in conjunction with this. Do we know anything about that? I mean, I don't know if that could be confirmed. Moscow Times isn't necessarily the best source in the world, but do we know what's going on with some of the top generals? Were any of them involved in this?
I mean, the way you phrased the question, do we know?
So
We don't
right.
know anything because we're thousands of miles removed.
Right.
What I can say is that every indication is that there have been no arrests. That this is purely a psychological operation run by the Ukrainians. It's been picked up by mainstream media in the United States, and they've run with it. Um, it appears that Surovikin is at work. You remember he's in charge of an air campaign that is in the process of destroying Ukraine's industrial infrastructure, electric grid, and air defense network. And today, more strikes took place. Gerasimov is the chief of the general staff, and he's running a war. Their job is not to appear in front of TV cameras to appease the Moscow Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, or anybody in the Western media. These are two leaders who are at war, and Russia's waging war, and so far Russia's doing a pretty good job. It appears they're winning this war. So I strongly doubt that
Hmm.
either Surovikin or Gerasimov have been arrested, detained, and I doubt at this point in time if any military officer has been. If for the simple fact that the moment to show their true colors would have been when Prigozhin made his move, and nobody rallied behind Prigozhin, not a single person.
So it's now the reports are that Wagner Group is no longer going to be fighting in Ukraine, that they were supposed to be signing a contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense, that they did not. And so none of the Wagner fighters are going to be fighting in Ukraine. If that's true, because I know that many of the fighters were maybe offered to be absorbed into the military itself. So maybe some individuals chose to go, but I'm not sure the number. If that is true, what is the future of this war? I mean, as you mentioned, there was a really great PR campaign. It seemed like Wagner was the one really on the ground fighting this battle, and that they were the ones who were getting the wins for Russia. So if they're no longer involved, then what is the outlook and and really the prospects of this ending anytime soon? This war in Ukraine.
Right. Just to correct a notion, Wagner won some very important battles, but they were assisted the entire time by the Russian army. Wagner can't do it alone. It's a private military contractor. They need the Russian Air Force. They need Russian artillery. They needed Russian paratroopers to protect their flanks. I mean, it's a team effort, and Prigozhin's not a team player. He's trying to take credit for for what the team did. Plus, the frontage that Wagner fought on was a very small part of the overall battle. The rest of the war is being fought and won by the Russian army. So again, we need to put Wagner in perspective. The other thing we need to understand is that Wagner was 25,000 strong. Only 8,000 men went into Russia went into the Rostov and moved on Moscow with Prigozhin. 17,000, including most of the senior commanders, remained behind and told Prigozhin to go to hell, that they're not going to commit treason. And this 17,000, I believe, have been absorbed into the Ministry of Defense, either as an individual capacity or in the case of some specialized units like a deep reconnaissance company, special assault companies. They would have retained their unit integrity, reformed as a volunteer unit, and be serving under the Ministry of Defense as a volunteer unit. So there's a large number of former Wagner soldiers fighting in Ukraine with the Russian army. 8,000 of them, however, will not be given this option, and they are going to either go home or go into exile in Belarus. Right now, there are 3 camps being built in Belarus, each one capable of housing up to 4,000 people. And the Belarus government and military have indicated that they will contract with Wagner to provide combat training to Belarusian forces to try and transfer some of the combat skills and knowledge that Wagner had. But notice what I'm saying, trainers. Wagner will not be fighting as part of the Belarusian military. Wagner will not be organized into combat units. But right now, NATO's in a panic. You have Poland panicking, Lithuania panicking, Kiev panicking. They say Wagner's in Belarus. Oh my goodness. We'll see what the future holds. But I have a hard time thinking that Lukashenko, who just a few years ago was worried about a coup in his own country, allowing Wagner forces, who already showed they're capable of high treason in marching on the capital if they don't get their way, to reform into military units. I have trouble seeing that happen. I have trouble seeing Russia allowing this to happen. We'll see what the future for Wagner is. But like I said, I don't hold high hopes for Prigozhin's future. I think he murdered 12 Russians. I think everybody needs to understand that. He murdered 12 Russian service members, shooting down their airplane. And while he can't be charged with that, he can be charged with corruption, and they're investigating him. And here's the other thing. It appears he might have been colluding with Western intelligence. And if that's the case, that's high treason. That's a separate treason charge. And that's the one that they put a bolt in the back of his head for. So Prigozhin's days, we'll see. I can't guarantee any outcome, but if I were Prigozhin, I'd have trouble sleeping at night.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting watching this. And I know that the Russian people, at least from the people that I've spoken to in Russia, my friends and others, their attitude and opinion of Prigozhin has definitely shifted. I mean, they were at first thinking the guy was a hero and they loved him. And then after this, they're like, oh, no, forget him. He can go to hell. It really, overnight, his entire, people just no longer. Right. Yeah. In just in those few hours. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. Always insightful. Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and author of, I'm going to try to say it, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika. Did I say it right?
You did. Very good.
Finally did it. Arms Control and the End of the Soviet Union, which you could grab that book. That link is down below. Scott, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, many are worried that the dollar may be in trouble. The world is turning away from the U.S., shoring themselves up because they're wanting to avoid sanctions and economic fallout, and they don't want to trade in dollars anymore exclusively. So a lot of people are worried about the future of their retirement accounts. And the fact is, there is one asset that has withstood economic upheaval and has a history being incredibly stable, and that is gold. And you can own it in a tax-sheltered retirement account with the help of Birch Gold. That's right, Birch Gold will help you convert an existing IRA or 401k, maybe from a previous employer, into an IRA in gold. And the best part is you don't pay a penny out of pocket. So visit birchgold.com/Kim to get your free info kit. They're going to hold your hand through the whole process. Birch Gold has an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau and thousands of happy customers. So visit birchgold.com/Kim to get your free info kit.